There's something quietly thrilling about a mystery that's been sitting in the dark for 500 years, and then one day, someone with a ground-penetrating radar and a lot of patience decides to take a second look. Tonight, we're going through some of the strangest cold cases in medieval history, stories that were dismissed for centuries as legend, superstition, or the dramatic ramblings of monks who maybe had a little too much monastery wine. Except, one by one, modern science has been cracking them open, and some of the answers are even weirder than the original theories. So get comfortable, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan, and let's get into it. Lincoln Cathedral. If you've ever seen it, you know it's the kind of building that makes you feel like you owe someone an apology just for not being more impressive. Flying buttresses, stained glass, stonework so dramatic it looks like it was designed by a very anxious theatre kid with a chisel and a point to prove. In the 1960s, archaeologists digging beneath this cathedral found a skeleton. Now, naturally, everyone assumed it was a monk, because what else would a dead person be doing under a medieval church? But this one didn't fit. No robes, no sacred trinkets, no crossed arms in the classic holy resignation pose. He looked less like Brother Gregory, and more like a guy named Steve who took a very wrong turn on the way to Canterbury. He was buried face down, hastily, the kind of burial that suggests someone was in a hurry and not particularly proud of the whole situation. In medieval England, that could mean anything from heresy to sneezing near the wrong bishop. Then science stepped in. Isotope analysis, basically reading the chemical memory locked in bones, revealed something nobody expected. This man wasn't local at all. He was Scandinavian. He had walked, yes, actually walked, all the way from Northern Europe, almost certainly a pilgrim making the long journey hoping for a miracle, or at the very least a decent relic to take home. He made it to Lincoln, and then he just didn't make it any further. Whether it was divine rapture or medieval shin splints, no one can say. The clergy couldn't exactly leave a Scandinavian corpse in the street. Bad optics. But they didn't exactly roll out the ceremonial welcome either. He got a quiet hole in the ground and something between a prayer and a shrug. For centuries, people assumed he'd done something shameful. Turns out he'd just believed hard enough to walk across a continent, and nobody thought to leave a name tag that said, "Not a heretic, just very tired." Richard III. You probably know him. The hunchbacked villain from Shakespeare, the man who famously shouted, a horse, my kingdom for a horse," which honestly sounds like the desperate cry of someone who just realised Uber doesn't exist yet. For over 500 years his remains were missing, lost somewhere between the Battle of Bosworth in 1485 and apparently a parking lot in Leicester. Yes, a parking lot. In 2012, archaeologists, armed with ground-penetrating radar and an almost admirable level of optimism, decided to dig up the car park behind Leicester's City Council building. Medieval records suggested that Richard had been buried at the nearby Greyfriars Church, which had since been demolished, paved over, and converted into parking bay number 7. Not exactly the royal resting place you'd imagine for a King of England, but here we are. They found a skeleton, male, late 30s, skull caved in from what looked like a very serious argument with a sword, spine twisted in a way that matched the scoliosis described in historical accounts. It was almost too perfect a match to be real. DNA testing confirmed it, not with some grand royal artifact, but by swabbing the cheek of a Canadian man who turned out to be Richard's 16th great-nephew. Imagine that phone call. "So, funny story, you're related to a medieval king. We found him under a car park. We need your saliva." Richard III was reinterred with full ceremony in 2015, no longer sharing his eternal rest with oil stains and the ghost of someone's parking ticket. His grave solved. His reputation still complicated. But at least the man finally has a proper bed. Discovered in 1912 by a Polish book dealer, the Voynich manuscript has been baffling historians, cryptographers, and at least one very determined person in a basement for over a century. It's 240 pages of completely unknown script and language, filled with bizarre star charts, plants that no botanist has ever been able to identify, and naked women floating in what appears to be green goo. It looks like what you'd get if a medieval herbalist and a fever dream collaborated on a colouring book. For decades, the going theory was that it was a hoax, some elaborate prank played on a wealthy nobleman with more gold than sense. Others insisted it was a lost language, A few people quietly floated the idea of a very eccentric wizard, but recently, a combination of artificial intelligence and linguistic analysis actually cracked parts of it. Not the whole thing, that would be far too satisfying, but enough to give academics a reason to high-five each other in Latin. The language appears to be a form of proto-Romance, an early offshoot of Latin that nobody thought had ever been written down. Medieval slang, essentially. Imagine finding out someone carved "tlol" into a monastery wall in 1420 and it turned out to be historically significant. The decoded sections include herbal remedies, female health guidance, and a medieval zodiac, which means the Voynich manuscript isn't a map to the Holy Grail or instructions for time travel. It's closer to a 15th century wellness blog, Gwyneth Paltrow but make it parchment. The mystery isn't fully solved, of course. We still don't know who wrote it, or why, or whether they ever imagined that people in the year 2024 would still be squinting at their illustrated bathtub scenes like they held the secrets of the universe. Probably not. But at least we know it wasn't gibberish. It was meaningful gibberish. There's a difference. Somewhere in 12th century Suffolk, in a quiet little village called Woolpit, which sounds like either a charming English hamlet or an aggressive sheep-related trap, 2 children appeared out of nowhere. No parents, no explanation, no context whatsoever. And they were green. Not metaphorically green, like new to the job. Actually, botanically green, like a salad. Like someone had taken the phrase, "you are what you eat," a little too literally. According to medieval chroniclers, who never exaggerated anything, these children wore strange clothes, spoke no known language, and looked like they had wandered out of a painting by Hieronymus Bosch. Villagers tried to feed them, and the children refused everything except raw beans, which is both specific and slightly concerning. Over time, they started eating regular food, and their green hue faded. The boy died not long after, not unusual in the Middle Ages where even mildly suspicious weather could be fatal. But the girl survived, learned English, and eventually explained that they had come from a place without sunlight, a land of eternal twilight. They had been following their father's cattle and wandered into Woolpit through a cave. The modern explanation? Flemish refugees, children who had fled political conflict, become severely malnourished, and ended up lost and confused in rural England. Dietary deficiency, specifically iron deficiency, can cause a greenish pallor. If you go long enough eating almost nothing but beans, your body apparently decides that chlorophyll is a reasonable skin tone. It happens, especially apparently in England. A quiet English church, candles flickering, Latin echoing through the stone. The priest is mid-sermon, probably warning everyone about the eternal consequences of cheese on Fridays. And somewhere in the back pew, one bored teenager is scratching a crude drawing of a sword fight into the wall, because he simply cannot sit through another 2 hours of this. For centuries, strange carvings inside medieval churches puzzled researchers. Interlocking circles, stars, daisy wheels. Yes, daisy wheels. The terrifying flower of doom were widely believed to be protective marks against demons, witch traps, hex wards, symbols designed to confuse evil spirits who, apparently, had failed basic geometry. Victorian scholars got very excited about this theory and decided that medieval people must have lived in constant fear of being dragged to hell by goat-hoofed demons during Mass, which, honestly, would make church more interesting. Then came the archaeologists with their laser scanners and their insistence on rational explanations. After documenting over 28,000 pieces of medieval church graffiti, they found that the vast majority were not demonic protection at all. They were names, drawings of ships and swords and cats, votive marks commemorating prayers, personal devotion, and in all likelihood, more than a few cases of just wanting to record that you existed. Gerald, 1378, I was here. Some of the symbols do have a magical element. A few circles may well have been intended as hex wards, but the idea that every single scratch on every stone wall was a desperate attempt to imprison Satan in a doodle is, well, ambitious. So next time you wander through an ancient English church and spot some scratched lettering on a pillar, don't panic. It's probably not a warning from the underworld. It's probably just Gerald, who couldn't sit still and had access to something sharp. Rungholt, whispered about for centuries like a soggy Atlantis, a wealthy, arrogant city swallowed whole by the sea in a single night as divine punishment for its hubris. The story goes that in 1362, a catastrophic storm called the Grota Mandrenke meaning the Great Drowning of Men wiped it off the map entirely. For a long time, people weren't even sure Rungholt was real. It might have been a fable, a cautionary tale invented to keep coastal communities humble, the medieval German version of clean your room or the sea will eat your town. But modern archaeologists have confirmed that yes, Rungholt existed, and yes, it absolutely got destroyed by the sea. Thanks to LiDAR scans, sonar mapping, and a team of very muddy German researchers in galoshes, parts of Rungholt's harbour walls, drainage systems and dikes have been found beneath the Wadden Sea. It was a thriving North Frisian port city with advanced water management infrastructure and serious trade connections. The cause wasn't entirely divine wrath, though. It was at least in part climate change. Medieval Europe was warming, storm surges were increasing, and the dike maintenance budget was apparently not keeping pace. When the 1362 storm hit, Rungholt was about as prepared as a sandcastle at high tide, so it wasn't arrogance and godlessness that sank the city. It was a warming climate, underfunded infrastructure, and spectacularly bad timing, which, depending on your perspective, might actually be more of a warning. The Cainton Caves in Shropshire, England. A sandstone network beneath a farmer's field that looks like a low-budget medieval dungeon, or possibly the set of a horror film with very high ambitions and very little money. Narrow passages, low ceilings, intricately carved pillars. It didn't take long before the internet arrived at its conclusion. Templars, secret rituals, holy relics, the whole Dan Brown package. For years, rumours swirled that the cave had been used by the Knights Templar after they were outlawed in the 14th century, hiding underground, performing forbidden rites, whispering Latin prayers and bumping their helmets on the ceiling. The dramatic lighting in photographs made the place look exactly like where a secret society would meet. Every photo looked like the opening scene of a thriller. Here's the thing though, the cave is probably not that old. Most signs point to a 19th century origin, the Victorian era, meaning the Templars had been gone for roughly 500 years before any of this stonework was carved. The actual users were likely a group of Victorian gentlemen with a flair for the theatrical and too much time on their hands. Members of fringe spiritualist groups used the cave in the 20th century. Modern-day pagans, goths, and at least one wedding photographer have all visited since. Weird things have definitely happened in that cave, just not the medieval kind. There's no hard evidence linking it to actual Templars, no relics, no inscriptions, not even a sword stuck in a stone, just carved pillars, atmospheric lighting, and the lingering disappointment of everyone who really needed this to be a conspiracy. The Princes in the Tower, a mystery so famous it has essentially become its own genre of historical argument. In the summer of 1483, two young brothers, Edward V, aged 12, and Richard of Shrewsbury, aged 9, disappeared from the Tower of London. Not wandered off disappeared, almost certainly murdered. The prime suspect for centuries was their uncle, Richard III, who conveniently locked them up for their own protection, and then just as conveniently became king shortly afterward. That's always a suspicious career move. But then there's Henry VII, who defeated Richard at Bosworth, married the prince's sister, and had every reason to ensure that no surviving York princes could challenge his claim. He's not talked about as much in this context. He probably appreciates that. In 1674, workers at the tower found a wooden box under a staircase. Inside, two small skeletons, child-sized. Charles II declared them the lost princes and had them reinterred in Westminster Abbey. No carbon dating, no analysis, no follow-up. Just royal intuition and a suspicious staircase. Those bones have never been properly tested. But that might be about to change. Recent pressure from historians and scientists has pushed for DNA analysis, comparing the bones to known royal descendants, which in theory could tell us definitively whether these were the York princes or two completely unrelated medieval children who happened to be in the wrong place during a renovation. The tools exist, the science is ready, the permissions are, in a very British way, still pending. We might be closer to solving a 500-year-old royal murder than at any point in history. We just need someone to sign the form. Strasbourg, 1518. A woman named Frau Trophea walks into the street and starts dancing. Not celebration dancing, not festival dancing. Uncontrollable, relentless, can't stop, won't stop dancing. Within a week, dozens of people had joined her. Within a month, reports describe up to 400 people dancing in the streets, unable to stop. Some collapsed from exhaustion, others suffered strokes and heart attacks. Some, by multiple accounts, danced until they died. The authorities, faced with this crisis, made a decision that says a great deal about 16th century medicine. They built a stage and hired musicians. The logic being, apparently, that if people were dying from dancing, what they really needed was a better beat. The Dancing Plague of 1518 is one of history's strangest mass events, and for centuries, explanations range from demonic possession to hot blood, a genuine medieval medical theory, to spider bites, which honestly would make anyone dance. Modern scholars lean toward two more grounded explanations. The first is mass psychogenic illness, group hysteria triggered by extreme collective stress. Strasbourg in 1518 was enduring famine, plague, and political instability. These were people wound to a breaking point, and sometimes a community under that kind of pressure can break in unexpected ways. The second theory is ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and produces compounds similar to LSD. It's the same culprit often linked to the Salem witch trials. If the local bread supply was contaminated, a significant portion of the population could have been experiencing hallucinations and uncontrollable physical responses without any understanding of why. The most likely answer is a combination: trauma, malnutrition, religious terror, and possibly toxic bread, all colliding in one devastating public breakdown. A medieval crisis that doesn't fit neatly into any single category, because real crises rarely do. Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, diagnosed with leprosy as a young boy, became king at 13, led armies from horseback, outmaneuvered Saladin, ruled for over a decade, died at 24. For centuries, historians have wrestled with the same question: what exactly did he have? Was it truly leprosy as we understand it, or was there something else going on? Recent studies suggest he may have had tuberculoid leprosy, a milder form of Hansen's disease that primarily affects the nerves and skin rather than causing severe disfigurement. The progressive loss of function in his limbs, which worsened over the years, fits the pattern of chronic nerve damage and muscle atrophy, not the full breakdown typically depicted in medieval art. There's also a theory that he may have had a different neurological condition entirely, something like Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, which causes remarkably similar symptoms. If true, it would mean that for centuries people simply pointed at a sick teenager and labelled him a leper without much further investigation, which, to be fair, was pretty standard medieval diagnostics. What's clear from contemporary accounts is that Baldwin's mind stayed sharp, even as his body deteriorated. He couldn't hold a sword toward the end, he couldn't mount a horse without help, he had to be carried into battle, and yet he continued to rule, negotiate, strategize, and appoint his successor with complete clarity of thought. He died from complications of progressive nerve degeneration, combined with the medieval healthcare system's general approach of just throwing herbs at things and hoping for the best. He was 24 years old, managing a crumbling kingdom, a collapsing body, and a court full of people waiting for him to die so they could fight over the throne. If that's not the most medieval job description ever written, I genuinely don't know what is. Somewhere in Europe, archaeologists excavating a medieval convent cemetery found something they were not expecting. A nun, buried in her habit, with a newborn infant nestled against her ribcage. Ancient DNA testing confirmed what everyone was already thinking. The infant was hers. This nun had broken her vow of chastity and clearly had not taken a subtle approach to the situation. What followed was the kind of forensic detective work that medieval confessional records could never have offered. The burial itself told a story. She was interred with full religious rites, which suggests that rather than facing formal punishment, the convent quietly absorbed the scandal and kept it internal. Medieval monastic communities were largely self-governing, and attracting the attention of the bishop, let alone Rome, was something to be avoided at almost any cost. Who the father was remains unknown. A passing traveller, a local man, a person in a position of authority. Any of these is possible. Some researchers have pointed to evidence of pelvic trauma as potentially indicating coercion, though others suggest it may simply reflect complications from the birth itself. What we know is this: a woman took vows, broke them, became pregnant, kept it secret, went into labour, and died. She was laid to rest with her child in her arms, her habits still intact in a grave that was kept quiet for centuries. DNA testing pulled the secret into the light hundreds of years later. The medieval world buried its scandals deeply. Modern science has a way of finding them anyway. For years, a particular skull found in a medieval European grave had people very quietly wondering about extraterrestrial visitors. Elongated cranium, unusual proportions, hollow-looking sockets. The kind of thing that, on a late-night documentary, gets accompanied by ominous music and a narrator whispering about ancient astronauts. The answer was considerably less dramatic, and considerably more interesting. The skull had been intentionally shaped. Cranial binding, the practice of wrapping an infant's head with cloth, boards, or small wooden devices to mould the skull as it grows, was a widespread cultural practice across multiple civilizations spanning thousands of years. Among certain nomadic groups and fringe aristocracies in early medieval Europe, an elongated skull was considered a mark of status, beauty, and social distinction. What made this skull notable was the extreme degree of elongation, the remarkable state of preservation, and, honestly, our modern tendency to see anything unusual and immediately reach for the alien explanation. Forensic DNA analysis eventually confirmed the skull belonged to a high-status woman, likely connected to Hunnic or steppe culture migration through Europe during the early medieval period. No spacecraft required. The shaping wasn't meant to make her look strange by the standards of her culture. It was meant to make her look distinguished. Beautiful, even. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of braces, orthodontic work, and aesthetic intervention, just applied considerably earlier in life and with noticeably more permanence. A girl skipping rocks across a lake in England. Her rock hits something solid. She reaches in. She pulls out a sword. Every local news outlet dusted off their Excalibur puns within the hour. To be clear, it was not Excalibur. But it was a genuine 9th to 11th century weapon of Anglo-Saxon origin, long, rusted and perfectly proportioned for defending a muddy castle from Vikings or settling a particularly nasty land dispute. Archaeologists dated the blade and turned to the more interesting question. What was it doing at the bottom of a lake? 3 theories. First, ritual deposition. Many ancient cultures threw valuable objects into bodies of water as offerings. It was a widespread practice, found across centuries and continents. Medieval Amazon returns, except the recipient lived in the algae and presumably appreciated the gesture. Second, panic dump. A fleeing warrior, about to be caught or robbed, throws his weapon into the water rather than surrender it. The medieval equivalent of wiping your phone before handing it over. Third, and most likely, it fell in by accident. Medieval people fished near lakes, washed things in lakes, and occasionally fought near lakes. If you've ever dropped your phone in a toilet, you understand how easily something valuable ends up somewhere it shouldn't be. The sword sits in a museum now, its exact story still uncertain, which honestly feels right. Some things should keep a little mystery. The Whispering Knights. 5 tall, jagged standing stones in the English countryside, leaning inward toward each other like colleagues sharing gossip around the office water cooler. They're part of the Rollright Stones complex in Oxfordshire, a prehistoric megalithic site that looks, generously, like a Neolithic IKEA set abandoned partway through assembly. Local folklore insisted the stones were cursed knights, turned to stone as divine punishment for trying to overthrow a king. Because in medieval Britain, the bar for supernatural retribution was apparently quite low. Modern geological analysis dated the stones to around 3,500 BCE, long before knights, long before any of the associated legend. They appear to be a Neolithic ritual site, possibly aligned with astronomical events, as many megalithic structures are. Ancient people built them. Ancient people loved pointing large rocks at the sky. But the whispering part, that turned out to be more interesting than anyone expected. Acoustic tests found that the shape and position of the stones create localized echo chambers. Sounds spoken in certain directions bounce and carry in ways that feel genuinely strange when you're standing there. In a world without physics textbooks, this would absolutely have seemed like the rocks were speaking, so they're not haunted, they're not cursed knights. But acoustically, legitimately unusual, and if you stand between them on a quiet night and say something softly, you might hear it come back to you from an unexpected direction. Whether that's science or something older is perhaps a matter of where you're standing. In medieval Europe, if your body refused to decompose properly after death, You had exactly two options available to you. You were either a saint, or you were something to be very afraid of. There was no middle ground. A well-preserved corpse meant either divine intervention or demonic interference, and which one you were assigned depended almost entirely on how popular you'd been while alive. One particular case involved a nun in a small Eastern European monastery. Quiet, unremarkable in life, buried during a hard winter. When her remains were moved months later, her body was found largely intact. Whispers of sainthood began almost immediately. Candles were lit. At least one kitchen boy reportedly fainted. Modern forensic analysis told a different story. Under the right conditions, cold, dry, well-ventilated crypts with lime-treated soil, a body can desiccate rapidly and naturally, essentially mummifying without any intervention at all. In some cases, a process called saponification transforms body fat into a waxy, soap-like substance that preserves remains for extraordinary lengths of time. No miracle, no demon, just a cold winter, an airy stone crypt, and the quiet physics of decomposition working in reverse. Our preserved nun had, incidentally, eaten almost nothing but pickled fish and rye porridge throughout her life. Not exactly the diet of a holy woman ascending to sainthood, but certainly effective as a preservative. The line between miracle and microbiology has always been thinner than people wanted to admit, especially in a world where the most advanced medical intervention available was a leech and a prayer. When people imagine Victorian crime solving, they picture fog, gas lamps, and a man with a magnifying glass walking very purposefully through narrow streets. Fiction gave us Sherlock Holmes. Reality gave us Scotland Yard. The Metropolitan Police was founded in 1829 under Home Secretary Sir Robert Peel. Uniformed constables could keep public order, but London was exploding into a city of millions, and with it came crimes too intricate, too layered, too clever for a man with a nightstick and a lantern. In 1842, a small detective branch was quietly established. 8 men in plain clothes, unannounced, unsanctioned by any great fanfare. The public did not immediately trust them. They didn't wear uniforms, they drank in taverns, they disguised themselves, they infiltrated criminal networks. Respectable Victorians read about this and worried, not unreasonably, that these men sounded less like police officers and more like criminals with a letter of endorsement. And yet, when the crimes came, the safe crackers, the con men impersonating aristocrats, the murderers who left no obvious trace, everyone turned to the Yard. These early detectives operated on instinct, street knowledge, and a slowly developing vocabulary of evidence. They were figuring out, in real time, what professional detective work even meant. Their methods were imperfect, sometimes wrong, occasionally brutal, but they were building something, a framework for investigating crime that prioritized observation and deduction over luck and rumour. By the 1860s and 70s, Scotland Yard's detectives were appearing in courtrooms with something new, documented evidence that carried genuine weight. They had become, against many people's expectations, indispensable. The fog and the magnifying glass came later in fiction. But the thing that fiction was always really about, the idea that a crime could be methodically unpicked, that the truth was waiting in the details if someone was patient enough to look, that started here. In a small room, with 8 men in plain clothes, who nobody quite trusted yet. In the early Victorian era, a murder investigation often amounted to a coroner glancing at a body, listening to some witness accounts, and making his best guess. It worked sometimes. It missed things, often. But quietly in the background, something was changing. Doctors had begun looking at a corpse differently, not just as a shell to be identified and buried, but as a source of evidence. The body, they argued, could tell you things the murderer hadn't planned on leaving behind. They cut open stomachs. They examined bruise patterns to determine whether injuries had occurred before or after death. They studied blood. They began building what would eventually become the science of forensic pathology, though nobody called it that yet. Toxicology emerged as one of the most significant breakthroughs. Arsenic, widely known at the time as the inheritance powder for how frequently it appeared in family poisoning cases, had been essentially undetectable. You administered it, the victim died, the coroner noted some kind of fever, and the matter was closed. Then chemical testing arrived, and suddenly arsenic left traces. Physical, measurable, undeniable traces. For the first time, a murderer could be exposed not by a witness, not by a confession, but by the body itself. The courtrooms of Victorian England began to change as a result. Medical experts stood in the witness box and explained things with a specificity and authority that juries had never heard before. The public followed these cases with a mixture of fascination and unease, because what was being demonstrated was something both exciting and quietly unsettling, that the human body, even in death, keeps secrets from everyone except science. It was the beginning of something we now take entirely for granted, the idea that evidence is evidence, that the truth, if you look carefully enough, is always there. It just needs someone willing to look.